So hi everyone, and welcome to the first session on FinTech and the Future Financial Services stage at day 2 of CogX 2021. My name is Nicolle. I'm the FinTech Correspondent for Financial News, and apologies if you can hear any banging on my end. There's construction works as always, but I'm sure we'll get through it. I'm delighted to be with you today for a special Tech London Advocates curated FinTech panel discussion. For the next 45 minutes, we're going to be asking the question, can London retain its FinTech crown? The latest figures from Innovate Finance show that the pandemic only caused a 9% slowdown for FinTech firms in the UK over the last year and a half or so. British FinTech startups still managed to attract $4.1 billion in 2020 in funding across 408 deals, which is pretty good going given the circumstances. The UK is still the top ranking destination in Europe for FinTech, and it's second only to the US in terms of capital raised. But however, we've had the twin challenges of Brexit and the pandemic to contend with, so not all is well in the sector. And while investment raise is a great metric of success, we wonder whether it tells the full story of what's going on in London. The recent Kalifa review outlined a number of recommendations that suggested London and the UK must do more to hold on to its FinTech supremacy. So to really understand what's going to come next for FinTech in London and how the sector can realise both future opportunities and fend off looming challenges, I'm joined by two leading figures from London's tech and FinTech ecosystem. First up, joining us virtually along with myself, we have Boden, who is Chief Executive and founder of Starling Bank, which is one of London FinTech's biggest success stories. The last 12 months have seen Starling Bank reach profitability, support businesses during the pandemic with CBILS, and raise £272 million in funding to reach a unicorn status. Anne was at CogX already yesterday to launch the Tech Zero Task Force, so I'm sure she'll talk a bit about that later. But today she's talking to us about the future of the industry that she personally helped create. Welcome, Anne. How are you doing?
Very well. Looking forward to today. What an exciting time we're at present, when everything's opening up.
Yeah, it's definitely a really seismic time for the sector, I think. And then also joining us today is Russ Shaw, who is one of the country's most vocal tech champions. He founded Tech London Advocates in 2013 to champion London as a global tech hub and to unite the private sector to address the challenges facing tech companies. Russ has been named a London Business Hero by the Mayor of London, is a founding partner of London Tech Week, which is another one similar to CogX, and Evening Standard has called him a titan of tech. And then within Tech London Advocates, there's also TLA FinTech, a working group to accelerate the growth of the industry, which is one of the largest private sector campaign groups for the industry. And Russ is also the founder of Global Tech Advocates, which now covers 20 tech hubs and regions globally. He's a very busy man. Welcome, Russ.
Hi, Emily. Good morning. Good to see you. Hi, Anne. Very nice to see you. And we've got an audience here with us, so great to see some faces here.
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't see you all, but I'm sure you're going to have eager questions. We will have time for those at the end, so please do think of them as we're going on. So just to get started, on the one hand, we have concerns about Brexit and the pandemic, but on the other hand, we have continued investment into FinTech and new unicorns like Starling, record levels of growth. Anne, why don't we come to you first? Do you think things are better right now than we thought they would be if we'd survived a global pandemic?
Absolutely. I remember sort of March last year, we just raised some money, but all of a sudden we had a pandemic. We didn't know how we were going to cope. We didn't know how consumers would react in this very, very difficult time. And yes, we've had huge heartache. We've had many people who have been hurt in fundamental family ways by this pandemic. However, businesses have succeeded. Starling's had a fantastic 12 months. We've hired over 400 people during the last 12 months. We have loaned more than 2 billion to small businesses, and we've reached profitability, and we've raised lots of money. And what actually happened is, all of a sudden, businesses and consumers have embraced digital. And we were talking about it for many, many years, and suddenly it's happened. And I don't think we're going back. I don't think we're going back to an old world. I think we're going to embrace lots of new technology and digital experiences. And I'm very excited this is happening now, and I'm very excited that we're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. We're definitely not going back, and the future, at least in London, has definitely been changed a lot by what happened with Brexit and where we think financial services might be even in just the next 12 months, let alone the next few years. Russ, do you have any insight there? How do you think things are going to be for fintech now that Brexit is on its way?
Yeah, I think the story for fintech, to echo Anne's points, is a very positive one. I do think if you look back over the past 12 to 18 months, the one part of the ecosystem that I think did struggle were more the earlier stage businesses. Many of them were struggling to raise funding. You know, it was great to see the Chancellor step in with the Future Fund, Innovate Finance getting a lot more grant application funding to make sure that we were supporting those earlier stage businesses. The later stage businesses, the scale-ups, the tech unicorns like Starling, I think have gone from strength to strength, and the future is very bright for them. The other thing I would just say is, you know, the London and UK fintech ecosystem is very strong. And I try and challenge people to look on the global arena and say, look, you've got the US, you've got China. The US fintech ecosystem is growing at a very fast pace. They probably were a bit slow off the mark, but the funding going into that is phenomenal. China is in a very different league. It was interesting to see the Ant Financial IPO being pulled just a few days before, indicating that the Chinese government is looking to put more regulation around the larger fintechs in China. But for me, the UK is kind of emerging as that third very important ecosystem. And I think that is our opportunity. And the gap that I see, if there is a gap, is how do we ensure that we have the funding, the scaling funding available for our UK fintechs to grow and expand on the global stage?
Yeah, and Russ, just to build on that point as well, definitely over the last year, but the groundwork was already there. The investment scene in London has really been maturing. Lots more funding is going to later stage businesses like Starling, rather than to the younger ones. As you mentioned, early stage businesses have kind of been left on the back foot. How do you see that changing if we come out the other side of this environment? Do you think that investors are going to kind of reinvent their portfolio strategies, or do you think this is kind of the way things will be for a while?
I think this is going to be the way that things are going to be. I mean, as long as we see a good track record of fintechs emerging, I'm hopeful that those later stage fintechs and unicorns will continue to secure the funding that they need. And there's a very big push, as probably many of you know, to have more of these fintechs IPO, particularly on the London Stock Exchange. There's the Lord Hill review that came out a few months ago, talking about how the London Stock Exchange can, I guess, liberalize, if you will, to make it a bit easier for these fintechs to float here rather than going to the NASDAQ in the US. And I think that's a very good opportunity ahead of us. So that's something that we want to watch. I'm still keeping an eye on those earlier stage seed funding businesses. That's not going to hit us in the immediate term, but we could see some gaps over the next 3 to 5 years if we don't keep an eye on that earlier stage in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I guess, Anne, you have a unique perspective to lend there as well, because you're one of those later stage businesses. And while it's not currently on the cards, you've said that an IPO is definitely in your future. And then also as well, you've said that Starling might intend to make more acquisitions in the coming years now that you're kind of getting to that proper unicorn state. So how do you see the landscape, and how can Starling help at both the later end and the earlier end of business?
I think it's fair to say that Starling is a bit different because we're a bank. And because we're a bank, we have certain funding challenges from the very, very beginning. You know, as a bank, as a fully regulated institution, you can't take advantage of a lot of the tax schemes up front. And VCs find it very, very difficult to embrace the whole banking concepts. And for Starling, our latest funding round was, you know, basically pre-IPO investors that are crossover funds and actually will hold the shares through an IPO. So we have, yes, funding is incredibly difficult for all businesses, and funding a bank is particularly difficult. But I think that Starling's now through the difficult phase in the middle. I think it's worth saying that all of us want to talk up the whole concept of London attracting finance, London attracting investors. But all entrepreneurs find it incredibly difficult raising funding, and that's wherever you are in the world. And it is, we do need to work really, really hard to make sure that the right businesses and the businesses are going to give great jobs and bring the right sort of ecosystems get that funding. It is tough. And just because, I've spent the last couple of years raising the funding and we've now got to a nice position, we all need to keep banging the drum about the need for more funding, the need for more support, and the fact that there is a dearth of funding in this middle period between the seed rounds and and getting to profitability. It's still quite difficult for people out there.
Yeah, and I think on that point, we're here today to discuss the Kalifa review, which is a large document that was recently published and as recommendations to policymakers and government on what we can do to help the fintech sector grow after Brexit and the pandemic. What for you were the most important takeaways on that, Anne?
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway was that an awful lot of people spent an awful lot of time really doing some tough thinking about what needed to be done. There were numerous work streams operating for quite a long period of time, and hats off to Ron and getting this report published. I think despite having the report, we now have to implement it. And that's a big job. And I think that there's a danger that we say, we've done the report, tick that box and we move on. There's a lot to be done, and taking that report to something that's we can execute and actually deliver the results is probably going to take years. And what I'm really worried about is that in the period of implementing that report, we'll all go up and do different things. We'll all get distracted, and this wonderful opportunity we have in fintech of bringing bringing jobs, not just to London, but across the UK, won't be fulfilled. The thing about our industry is that it is bringing, well, I'm today in Southampton. We have 250 people working in Southampton. We have 550 people working in Cardiff in South Wales. Fintech is real. It's actually generating those great, a huge amount of buzz, but as well as all the cocktail parties, we're now bringing real jobs to the UK.
Yeah, those cocktail parties are pretty infamous. But for Russ, what do you think were, kind of the one or two most important takeaways from the Kalifa review? Can you point to any of the specific recommendations it made that you think were super important for government to listen to?
Yeah, I agree. First of all, I agree with Anne's point about implementation. I'll come and talk about that in a moment. I was part of the Kalifa review. I was in the international element of it for me, which is very exciting. And, initiatives around creating a center for finance innovation and technology, creating international fintech ambassadors, expanding the fintech bridges. We've got fintech bridges with Singapore, with Australia, with Korea. I think we need fintech bridges with the US as well. So I think there are a lot of good components to it, and I think the issue will be around how can we implement them and implement them quickly. We really need to drive more inward investment into the UK from fintech businesses and investors around the world. And, touching a bit more on what we were saying earlier, we really need to drive that international expansion for those UK fintech businesses who are here. And I think the Kalifa review addresses that. The other piece of the Kalifa review, which I wasn't directly involved with, but was led by Sherry Kutu, who founded the Scale Up Institute, runs Founders for Schools, is all around skills. One of the challenges that we face, not just in fintech, but in the tech sector more broadly, is a shortage of talent, a lack of diversity in talent. And we really need to double down on the skills component of that and we need to drive a greater diversity in fintech message, which is something I think the Kalifa review didn't pick up on. But we need to look at all of those things. There's a great coalition of all kinds of leaders, people like Anne and many others, who really want to see these recommendations implemented, and we need to move quickly on that. Speed is of the essence.
Yeah, Russ, you make a great point there about diversity and inclusion. That was something that a few people in fintech picked up on as something being missing from the Kalifa review. Women, for example, and people of colour really weren't a major focus, despite being something that the fintech sector has worked quite hard to try and embrace more diverse hiring and make sure that the sector fully represents what the UK as a country looks like, and London in particular as well, being a multicultural city. And do you think that fintech has done enough to kind of change attitudes towards diversity in recent years? And what could they do in the next 10 years that can make a difference?
Things haven't changed an awful lot. The majority of people involved in the fintech industry are, white men in their 30s with beards. Okay, let's face it.
Are you talking about some of your rivals, Anne?
But that is, but until we see many more sort of diverse entrepreneurs in all sorts of ways, it is so important that those of us who don't fit the typical mold of a fintech founder are visible and sort of spread the message that you too can start a business. You too can do this. I'm a computer scientist that have been in the financial services industry a long time. And I wasn't the typical candidate to start a fintech company. And it is possible, but diverse sort of population of entrepreneurs find it harder. It's easier for VCs to invest in people that look like them and sound like them and have done a similar sort of education to them. Breaking that mold, you have to be a brave VC. And VCs sometimes take the easy options. And in order to actually make sure that we, break that mold, we need to talk about it. And we need successes. We need successful businesses that can say, yep, this group of people created a great company, a great fintech company, and they're not like other companies, and it has been successful.
And picking up on areas that were ignored as well, climate change was a big one that people think the Kalifa review missed out on tackling, and you're both involved in campaigns that focus on tech challenging for net zero. Russ, why do you think that fintech can have a big role in that fight against climate change?
Yes, I'll answer that in just a minute. I just want to build on the diversity piece, because I think it is critically important. We did with our TLA Black Women in Tech and UK Black Tech, we did a Black Tech Leaders Survey, and we released the results 3 weeks ago. And that community has echoed many of the points that Anne was just making, very much saying, look, people are listening now, but they're not taking enough action. They want to see greater diversity of management teams and executive boards. Part of the survey, we also asked, tell us which of those tech companies that you see out there that are doing a good job. And as you would expect, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts did pretty well. But interestingly for me, Monzo came out as number 6 or number 7. So I think we should take a look at what is Monzo doing? What are some of these other companies doing that is scoring highly with, for example, Black tech leaders in the community saying these are companies that are doing great things. On to your point about fintech and climate, I think there's a huge opportunity here. You just look at the G7 summit, and there's a lot of discussions around climate and climate change. I don't think they spoke enough about climate finance. And I think that's an opportunity, a significant opportunity for the fintech sector. You're seeing, fintechs like Stripe in the US launch something called Stripe Climate, where they're going to take proceeds from some of their transactions and divert it to, carbon reduction schemes and things like that. You've got Atmos Financial that is setting up savings accounts for customers, and that enables them to loan money to carbon companies that are reducing their carbon footprint. So you've got emerging examples of the role that fintech can play in terms of climate change, both in terms of the companies that are emerging to try and tackle it directly, but I think fintech can have a very, very significant voice in terms of funding many of the climate change initiatives that are out there today.
And what do you think of that as well, given that you were on stage at CogX talking about this yesterday?
I think that when you talk about fintech and consider what you need to do to solve this big problem, you have to realize that fintech itself doesn't deal with the problem day to day, right? The vast majority of companies have to transform themselves into using different energy sources in actually trying to educate and retool the organization for a different world that's far more sustainable and is far more considerate of the environment. The fintech industry itself is almost there. You know, we are a digital industry. So we've got to try and figure out how we have the right to influence other industries if we're not experiencing ourselves. And one of the tools we can use is our balance sheet and our lending capability. And I think that the government and the regulators around the world are showing the way. And there could be an interesting path where organizations with balance sheets such as ourselves could, with government help, direct that funding in the right way to the right companies that make the most change. Yes, we have to set a good example ourselves. But I think that we as an industry have to be a facilitator. And at the moment, we're probably not feeling the pain that other larger companies in different industries are feeling, because they have to realize they have to go through a humongous amount of change in order to get where they need to be.
But I also think that not feeling that pain is the opportunity now for the fintech sector. And I think, and part of what we try and do with Tech London Advocates and Global Tech Advocates is to showcase and to promote those organizations that are really embracing this. We've got an investor showcase event coming up on the 30th of June, and the whole focus is on tech for net zero, hearing from the investors that are out there in the community. What are they investing in? What excites them in the fintech space that is helping them to look at tech for net zero? We've got a startup commitment. We're asking startups to think about what is it that you can do. And some of them are saying, look, we're trying to do what we can. But when we conducted a couple of roundtables 2 months ago, some of them said, the one thing we're not doing a good enough job on is tracking the measurements, putting the KPIs in place that really shows how we're moving the needle. So I think that is a key part of what I think we can look at in fintech, which is not only what can they do, but how can they demonstrate how each individual company is moving the needle in this space, whether it's lending as Anne described, or whether it's actually their own offices, their own staffs, and the people that they're saying, look, we all have to collectively sign up for this. This is a massive, massive thing for all of us, as we know. So, we can have governments do sweeping policy statements and things like that, which is great. But, I've learned in running this community over 8 years, you got to work it from the grassroots perspective, individual by individual, company by company. And if we collectively do that, we will start to move the needle. Sorry, Emily, I know I jumped over you there.
Oh, no, it's fine. But yeah, on that point as well, there are other ways that fintech can really help, like you said, have that grassroots effect. And one area that was identified by the review and something that the government has been quite instrumental in is this idea of levelling up other parts of the country. Obviously, fintech is probably one part of the big London bubble that there is. It's obviously a big hub because of its closeness to the regulators and the major banks being headquartered here. So fintech has really thrived in the city, but elsewhere it probably needs some more help. And Anne, you've been a part of that obviously with Starling. So how do you think fintech can start to actively benefit everybody across the country, not just in terms of company involvement, but the consumers and people that it caters to?
Yeah, well, sort of Starling's growing faster outside London than in London. Starling has always been a bank for people up and down the country. We take levelling up really, really seriously. As I've said before, we have the majority of Starlings now work outside London. Today I'm in Southampton office. We've also got a big office in Cardiff. So yes, fintech exists outside Shoreditch. We may have all our meetings there, and we may actually think it's very, very cool. But what's really important is that we give everybody the tools to conduct their financial life. And that's really, really valuable. And that's what we take very seriously. And that we give people great jobs and teach them great skills. The fintech industry is such a variety of skills you need to work in it. Creative skills, data science skills, coding skills, customer empathy skills. It's a great industry. And with the lockdown, sort of lifting and people going back into offices and starting to embrace this new world, I think the new world's going to be better. We can hire people in a much wider range of roles around the whole country, because people are not going to go into the office every day. They're going to go work in a hybrid way. And that means we can be more inclusive. We can hire people in different sorts of contracts. And we can take the magic of fintech up and down the country to lots of people. And that's a great, great option.
And then just as our final kind of question to you guys before we pivot to audience questions, so hopefully everybody's been thinking of questions they'd like to ask the panel. Russ, coming to you on this last one, given that London is mostly your focus and London's already been recognised as a global capital for fintech, what do you think it needs to do next to keep that position? Levelling up the rest of the country is great, but we can't let London fall behind either at its expense.
Yes, I agree. And I often talk about it's not the tyranny of the or, it's the greatness of the and. And, we have to keep driving the leveling up agenda across the country. And I would actually say that the growth of fintech across the country was already happening well before this term leveling up became popular. I mean, if you look at Manchester today, there's 8,000 fintech workers in Manchester. You've got Novo, you've got Mojo, you've got Bankify, you've got University of Leeds with their Center for Financial Technology and Innovation. You've got great things happening in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We've got global tech advocates groups in Belfast and Edinburgh and Manchester. So it is happening, but we can't ignore that London is a fantastic global asset for this nation. Over the years, I've always said, and maybe I'm an American who's lived here for 30 years, but I think London is the world's only truly global city. And that is reflective of what's happened in our technology sector with fintech being, that shining star. But we can't be complacent. We can't be arrogant. We have to double down and work that much harder. The pandemic has hit hard. Brexit is creating some challenges. We still do not have a UK EU data adequacy agreement in place. It was punted till the end of June, if you remember correctly. That's, if we don't get that agreement in place, that's going to hit cloud businesses, fintech businesses, digital payment businesses pretty hard. So we have to keep the focus on that. We have to, coming back to the start of the conversation, keep the investment pipeline growing and building. And I really, echo Anne's comments about how hard it is to raise money. In a previous life, I was the latest stage CEO of a startup, and I did a Series D round, and it nearly killed me. And, I look at the great work that Anne is doing and how she keeps driving it, but these things take their toll. So we have to work with these companies to ensure that the funds are available. So let's keep building on what we're doing. We've got a really good successful model. And maybe the one other piece of this that we haven't talked about is the regulatory environment. 2 years ago, I spoke in Beijing at the NGC forum, which is a national forum there. They invited me to talk about UK fintech. And I had my 7 points all lined up and how wonderful it is. And it was all in Mandarin. I was one of just 2 English speakers, and I was all ready to talk about the Financial Conduct Authority, the sandboxes, and the innovation that they're driving. And I didn't have to do that because the 2 Chinese speakers before me were referencing that as a world-leading example of the regulatory frameworks that the UK has through the FCA. So one other thing that we should put into this mix and conversation is let's keep focusing on the regulatory framework. Let's support the London Stock Exchange to open up and get more IPOs that are coming out of the UK. I think that's where we need to drive more of this.
Yeah. So I think there's an MC in the room with you, Russ,
Yes,
who can
Joy
help
is
us
here.
point towards some audience questions, if we've got any lined up already.
Sure. And here she comes. Hi, Joy.
No, come on, don't be shy, anybody. Here we are.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for a wonderful presentation. My name is Nicolle. I wanted to ask, normally when we talk about diversity and climate change, we think about companies that are like, 1,000 people or more. That's where you can change. But if you're like starting out and you're a company of 1, how do you position yourself to not have to do the change when you're a company of 1,000?
I think that's a great question. My sense of that is if you build that into your company values right from day one, it will make it far easier for you down the line. And the example I would use is Slack. I met the CTO of Slack a few years ago, and Slack has a good reputation for really driving a D&I agenda. And when I spoke to the CTO, he said, look, when they set up the company, there were 4 or 5 of them. They said they put D&I at the heart of who they were about and what they were doing. And he said to me, I couldn't imagine by the time we got to 200 suddenly having to shift and refocus, having built the company in a very different way. And I think the same approach that you're taking with climate change, if you build it in right from the start, it might add some additional challenges towards your very busy day. But at the same time, if it's inherent in your organization right from the get-go, I think that will make it far easier for you down the line. So I would applaud what you're doing if you can really do that. A lot of the earlier stage startups I'm talking to do that and are trying to do that. And I think that will only help them as they grow and expand. So I don't know, Anne, if you want to jump in on that as well.
Okay. In the early stage of a startup, people get together with friends and colleagues and start a business. And it tends to be that people look and sound alike at that stage. And people like Paul Graham, in some of his essays, have actually been saying that is going to be, that having diversity in the early days of a company is a risk. And we've had VCs saying that for a long time. We've got to break that. We've got to break that thinking that there's too much team risk when you have people of different, that look and sound different in the early stages. Because VCs see difference at an early team in the first 10 people as being a risk, and would much rather deal with teams that look and sound the same. And we've got to knock that out of the system. And we've got to get VCs to appreciate that people of different ages, different genders and different backgrounds of all sorts is a good sign rather than a bad sign.
Hear, hear.
Great, those were great answers. Thank you both. Is there any other questions in the audience?
I think we've got time for one more, Joy is saying.
A short, sharp one. No, everybody's a little bit too shy for that short, sharp one. Do you want to perhaps have a minute for closing thoughts?
Yeah, so I think probably we've heard a lot today about what the fintech sector can do to kind of help itself in the next few years, and the Kalifa review will surely be part of that. I think something that would be nice to end on is if both Russ and Anne could kind of provide what they think that the review really did well and what it needed to do better in terms of one short, sharp takeaway that they could take from it for the future?
I think it got us all together to have some really serious conversations. It's not just the outcome of the report. It's those conversations we had in our various work streams to get together to really do some deep thinking of what it takes to make sure that London does not lose its lead. And the report is out. And now we need to make sure we stick together to implement that particular report so it actually achieves all its potential.
I agree with that. I would also add the thing that excites me, because I not only look at fintech, I look at tech more broadly. This is an amazing blueprint that we can use for other tech verticals, whether it's around AI, quantum, health tech, med tech, biotech. Many different tech verticals can look at this. And the other thing I would just say is it's been very interesting for me to see the rollout of this. I was with a group of ambassadors from around the world about 2 months ago, and the Brazilian ambassador to the UK said, we are all reading the Kalifa review very closely. And I think the Kalifa review is going to become in itself a global brand. So it's a great blueprint for how to do this for fintech, and I hope for multiple tech verticals going forward.
Yeah, those are great points. Well, so thank you to both of you panelists, Anne, Boden and Russ Shaw, for joining us today. And thank you to CogX for hosting us today, and for all of you for joining both in the cinema there in King's Cross and online. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. I think we've got a few more sessions lined up today that are going to be really great. So I hope you have a great rest of the week as well.